This is episode 161. Is bow hunting inhumane? Is killing an animal with an arrow an inhumane thing to do? Well, there's a lot of folks who insist the answer is yes. And that is somewhat reflected in the regulations, as hunting with archery tackle is illegal in most of Europe. And I am not surprised if those opinions are expressed by, let's say, a veterinary professional with particular interest in animal welfare, who on top of that had very little, if none, experience and exposure to bow hunting. But when those opinions are expressed by hunters, I'm almost bothered, especially that those hunters had also no exposure, no real-world exposure to bow hunting. And in the second part of this podcast, you will hear a story about a hardcore old European hunter who changed his mind about bow hunting once he took part and participated in a hunt with archery tackle. So that's in the second part of this podcast. But I think it is my role here in this podcast to bringing you different opinions, different points of view. And this is probably third or fourth episode where we're going to talk about bow hunting. So today we are joined by an expert bow hunter, Jim Clark. Jim hunts with archery tackle close to 4 decades. He hunts with a compound bow, with a recurve bow. He hunted with a crossbow, and obviously he hunted with a rifle. So his opinions and his views, I think, they are very well thought out. And he has a wealth of experience, and he's sharing that with us today. And as usual in those episodes, I'll push him a little bit, asking him questions about hunting with archery tackle and bow hunting that might be uncomfortable. And you gotta hear his answers. In the episode, we also discuss the development and progress in technology of archery tackle, and how this might or might not impact the humaneness of an endeavor. And also Jim will share some of his hunting stories. So overall, that was a very enjoyable episode to record. And I hope you will learn a thing or two about bow hunting and hunting with archery tackle. And just to be clear, if you are against bow hunting or you think it is an inhumane thing to do, I'm not expecting you to change your mind after listening to this episode, but maybe, just maybe, on the surface of your strong opinion, little crack appears. And if that happens, my job is done. This is what we do in this podcast. We discuss issues related to environment and human-wildlife interactions that are sometimes controversial, maybe not clear-cut. And the role of the podcast is to present different angles and different opinions on those aspects. So this is one of those episodes. And as always, before I let you enjoy this episode of the podcast, just a reminder that if you're interested in the subjects we're discussing here and you want to dive deeper in those subjects, you should subscribe to my newsletter. This is called Conservation and Science Newsletter. The link is obviously in the description of the show. And that newsletter comes together with podcast episodes, and it usually contains some other reading and other materials that will allow you to dive deeper into the subjects we discuss on the podcast. And also, you'll get the notifications there about live events, whether events where I'm speaking live, or maybe I'm just attending, participating. So if it's something that interests you, you can join the event, you can go to the event, and if you see me there, come up and say hello. So that's it for the introduction. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, Jim Clark and hunting with archery tackle. Jim, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Tommy. I really appreciate it. Been looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, and as listeners of this podcast know, and as you already know as well, I'm really keen to talk about bow hunting anytime I can, because bow hunting is just not a thing in Europe. And I hope that maybe if there's going to be like one or two people who starts, pushing right buttons to get the bow hunting going in Europe to the greater extent, because there are some places in France, I think that in Spain there are some provinces where you can bow hunt, but in general you cannot bow hunting. Where I am in Ireland, it's a no. In the UK as well, where the probably majority of the listeners are. So I'm very keen to talk about it, and we have a lot to talk. So before we start, Jim, could you give us like a brief introduction, who you are, what you do, and how you got started in bow hunting?
Yeah, absolutely, Tommy. So my name is Jim Clark, and I grew up in Chicago, Illinois. So in a city, fairly good-sized city. And since a young age, I always loved the outdoors. It was just one of those things where I was always taking my fishing rod and going down to the local pond and things of that nature. And once a year, my dad would take us on a pheasant hunting trip. So I got exposed to hunting a little bit through my father and his business, but he was not a passionate big game hunter nor a bow hunter. But I just fell in love with the whole lifestyle of pursuing game and the tremendous challenge and fulfillment that I got out of that, even though I started small time. And so as I got older, I started working in a sporting goods store and was introduced, the sporting goods store sold bows. And I was like, wow, that is cool. And I'd shot the little bows when I was a kid, right? But never a real bow. And so I started shooting at that store, and I fell in love with archery. And I got introduced to the concept of bow hunting for deer, which was much easier to get a tag, right? So the reason I started bow hunting was I had never gun hunted up to that point, but there was a lot of areas that had public ground that you could bow hunt only. Where I grew up outside of Chicago, Illinois, they didn't allow gun hunting, just bow hunting. So I'm like, well, this is perfect for me. I can learn a new sport that's pursuing big game, which I thought was the sport of kings and still believe that. And I started, and I didn't really know what I was doing. So I did a lot of reading, and I didn't really have any mentors at the time. So I just started figuring it out with another friend of mine. So that's how I got started in bow hunting. And I've pursued it my whole life from that starting point.
So you never started like with a rifle and then graduated to the bow. You just started straight up. Bow was the first type of hunting you started.
I did, and that's a little unusual, based on all the friends that I now know that bow hunt. A lot of them started in different ways. Mainly started gun hunting and then wanted more of a challenge in bow hunting. But I started bow hunting because it was the only opportunity that I had, and it was very accessible, right? In many areas in the United States, bow season starts way earlier than rifle season. It's 3, in some cases 4 months long, whereas rifle season or even primitive weapon season is very short. So it opened up a lot of opportunity with longer seasons and created a great challenge, right? Because bow hunting is certainly very challenging, particularly with the equipment that we had 35 years ago when I started. But I fell in love with it, and since then I've done more gun hunting and so on. But I've shot and harvested many more animals with a bow than a gun.
What is for you the main difference between bow hunting and hunting with a rifle?
If I was to boil it down to a word, it's intimacy, meaning the ability to be very intimate with the animal because they're very close. The requirement to get very intimate about your knowledge of their movements, where they bed, where they feed. You have to really study the movements of the animals to put yourself in position between where they are and where they're going. Whereas with a rifle, you can sit on an opposite hillside and know a general area that's good for deer or elk or whatever it may be, and see animals in a distance, and today shoot them at 600 yards. So that has its own challenge and own fulfillment. I'm not knocking that, but I love the intimacy of bow hunting.
Is there going like a little bit of a rivalry between the bow hunters and rifle hunters?
It's an interesting question. I would say there is a bit, but rifle hunters know they have a tremendous advantage, right? But their seasons are typically late in the season. After the rut in most states is when you can gun hunt. So the rifle hunters sometimes are a little bit miffed that the archery guys get to hunt during the peak of the mating season of the rut. which is when the animals are most vulnerable. So there's a little bit of that. But bow hunters have the added challenge. So in my years of experience, I've never run into like a real rift between gun and bow. At least in the circles I travel, I know it exists, but I haven't really run into that. I respect rifle hunters, and I feel like they respect what I do as a bow hunter. But I have heard stories of friction there for sure. But I don't really see a need for it. We're all there to enjoy the same thing. We just do it in our own way.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of like a separation of seasons is helping that you, because I presume it wouldn't work if the season, like, is there, maybe that's a question. Is there situations that you can hunt the animals both with the rifle or with the bow?
There is. In most states in the U.S., you can legally hunt deer during gun season with a bow.
Okay.
Provided you're following all the regulations of a gun hunter. So if they require blaze orange, you have to be wearing blaze orange. If they require an extra tag, you have to have that extra tag. But you can legally bow hunt during gun season. Now that has its obvious disadvantages. However, but if you're on private ground that you have exclusive rights to hunt and there's guys gun hunting all around and you want to have it harvest an animal with a bow, that's actually not a bad time because they're a lot of times moving those animals onto your property.
That's true. That's true.
I've done some of that, and it can be effective.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about the safety measures because you need to get so much closer to the animal. I can almost imagine you're just trying to take a shot at the animal, and then someone 200 yards, boom!
It can happen.
Shoots the animal.
It can happen. And you mentioned safety. That's paramount. Like when you're bow hunting during gun season, you have to be very aware. And yet in most states, I would always wear blaze orange during gun season, full stop, whether it's required or not. Absolutely. Because of that safety reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we jump into a little bit further into the details of bow hunting, I got to ask you also about crossbow. So that counts as a archery equipment.
Yes.
And the probably you can elaborate now whether there's a separate season for crossbow. Probably depends on the state, or is it like archery equipment is all encompassing? So if you could give us a little bit of a insight on this, keeping in mind that most of the listeners of this podcast never hunted with a bow, never hunted with a crossbow, and might not even be fully aware of what are the differences in effectiveness and so on.
Okay, great. Well, it's a really interesting question, and that is a hot button in many circles. But just to boil it down, when you're shooting a bow, whether it's a traditional recurve longbow, where you don't have a sight on it and a release, or you're shooting a compound bow, which often has a sight and a release, so it's a little bit easier to be accurate at a distance, you still have limitations relative to you still have to draw the bow back, hold it back, keep it on target, and make a clean release with an unmagnified sight pin if you're cutting with a compound bow. So there are limits to the range and accuracy and so on. With a crossbow, the primary distinction is it's more like a rifle in that once you cock it and put the bolt in, it stays cocked. And the arrow, which is called a bolt in a crossbow, is much smaller. It's shorter and heavy. So it travels extremely fast and flies extremely flat. So you're much more accurate out to 70, 80 yards with a crossbow than you would ever be with a compound. And when you get the animal in close, you don't have to draw back the crossbow. It's already cocked like a rifle. So you just point and shoot, and you can put a scope on a crossbow. So a crossbow has, I think, more similarities to a rifle than it does a bow relative to the advantages you obtain by always having it cocked and ready to shoot. It has a safety on it, and you can put a scope on it. The similarities are they both use a bended bow limb to propel the arrow. That's about the only similarities. So I'll just stop there. From just the different standpoint, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously because of that, also the range you can shoot an animal is way longer or higher, or you can shoot an animal for a greater distance with a crossbow, I presume.
You can. I mean, obviously, there's people out there that can shoot a compound bow very accurately, particularly out west where we're hunting big country, longer distances. They'll shoot maybe even out to 40, 50, even 60 yards, which is really long with a bow. But with a crossbow, but that takes a high degree of skill.
Yeah.
Someone who's never shot a crossbow. Have you ever shot a crossbow in your life?
No, I did not.
If you picked up a crossbow today, if I handed you one that was sighted in and you went to shoot it, you could shoot it very accurately out to 70, 80 yards in your very first try. So imagine that it takes a way more practice and expertise to accurately shoot a bow out to, say, 60 yards than with a crossbow, who you could just pick it up and shoot it, which gives a lot of people confidence to take a lot longer shots maybe than they're capable. Different story. But that's the difference primarily.
Is it then causing the, again, tension between the, like a classical, let's call them bow hunters and crossbow? Because it's like, okay, we have this season for bow hunting and it requires skill and all those things and all that. Then, someone shows up, like you said, with a crossbow first time in their hands, and they have all the, advantages, let's say, of the early archery season and so on.
That you're absolutely right. There is tension and friction there, and it really gets down to the advantages of the equipment that you reference. In other words, people who bow hunt, at least speaking for myself, I chose to bow hunt because I love the challenge and the intimacy of getting closer to the deer. And part of the challenge is the requirement to really practice shooting your bow and really get good at it. And I shot traditional. I shot recurve for the first 25, 30 years of my hunting. So I really, actually I started with a compound bow, shot a few deer with it, and I'm like, I want something else. And then I went to a recurve and hunted with a recurve traditional bow for about 30 years, I think. And, it was by choice, but it's because I enjoyed the challenge and the intimacy and the requirement to practice and so on. And so most folks that bow hunt feel like bow hunting with the longer seasons should be limited to more, traditional archery equipment, because you're giving a longer opportunity to hunt, because you have a bigger challenge with the equipment. Once you enter crossbows into that equation, right, there is some friction, because it's like, look, we're having someone who's hunting with a crossbow has the advantage of a rifle hunting in a traditional equipment season. And that's really where the friction is. What I can say is, in the United States, and I don't know the exact numbers, I haven't studied the numbers, but there are a lot of states where archery in archery season, you can only hunt with a compound or a traditional bow, like a longbow or recurve. Crossbows are not allowed. The only time they would be allowed is if you had a disability and you applied for a permit and you got granted a permit based on some kind of a doctor's, disability note, and it has to be approved by the state. So they're not allowed in bow season. They are allowed in what's called, there's a primitive weapon season in a lot of states, which is primarily muzzleloaders, and oftentimes crossbows are allowed in muzzleloader season.
Oh.
Because they're actually more akin to that. If you think about the effective range of a muzzleloader being, let's say, I should say a traditional muzzleloader, out to about 100 yards. Well, that's kind of, with a crossbow, you're good out to nearly there. So in other states, for example, Ohio or Kansas, crossbows are allowed in bow season as a traditional weapon. And there is some friction there because of what I mentioned earlier. It's like, hey, you're coming in and you're not being held to the same standard of scouting and getting close to the animal and practicing and so on and so forth. You can come in and shoot a deer at 50, 60 yards with a crossbow fairly easily. And so that's the distinction. And there is some friction there. And it's state by state. It's been a battle between the traditional archers and the guys that, oftentimes the manufacturers that want it legalized in the state, because they're going to sell a lot more crossbows if it's legal during bow season. You know the economics of that. So
of course,
that's where the tension is. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for laying that out for us, Jim. And you mentioned like an interesting thing that I want one more in kind of like an equipment front. and this is something we mentioned briefly before we started recording this podcast, is that there's a traditional equipment, skill required, traditional bow, compound bow. But then when you look at the compound bow, well, it's nothing but traditional. You have space age materials, and you have a precision machining and 3D printing and all the technology. I would argue that even if I go and buy a new rifle, like a Tikka or whatever, decent rifle, it's actually technologically very old and obsolete compared to when I go and buy a new compound bow, which is all the latest. So I'm curious, like, what's your view, what's your comments maybe on this? Because this is one of the things that I often hear, like, oh, this is like traditional, like, no traditional at all.
Yes, it's having shot both compounds and traditional recurves and shot animals with both. I have mixed feelings on it. With respect to a traditional bow, recurve or a longbow, when you pull a 65-pound bow back, you're holding 65 pounds. So you can't hold it for long, right? You got to pull back and shoot, and you're shooting instinctively, meaning no sights. When you are with a compound, of course, we talked about the advantage of being you pull it back and there's a release. So if you're pulling back 65, maybe you're only holding 30, 35 at full draw. So you can hold it for longer, let the animal get close, right? And then you have oftentimes a trigger release. So you can hold it, and when you release, you're not relying on your fingers doing the work. You're just pulling a trigger, so you get a good clean release more frequently. So those advances are normal and have evolved. And on the one hand, I'm in favor of anything that helps people make a clean, humane kill shot. Like, to me, that's the most important thing: respecting the animal and making a good, clean, humane shot. And so things like sight pins and releases on a compound bow enable the average hunter to more accurately place a shot on an animal and have a humane kill. So having said that, when you start getting to advancements like bow sights that have magnification, or bow sights that have lighted pins and magnification, and the ability to turn a dial to adjust to 27 yards or 36 yards, or bow sights that have integrated rangefinders in them.
Yeah, I heard that. That's the latest, right? With the bow sight with the rangefinder.
Okay, so there you go. So then you say, well, wow, those really make it much easier for someone to effectively range an animal, dial in their sight, and make a clean shot at further distances. Jim, how do you feel about that? Well, again, I just said anything that helps an archer make a clean, humane shot more consistently is a good thing. And those elements I just discussed, those advancements certainly do that, right?
Yeah.
But at what point does the advancement in technology start to reduce the level of challenge that's required to bow hunt, and bring in a lot of folks into the sport that just want to have it? They just want to hunt deer more frequently and make it easy.
And by the way, you can make the same argument about the crossbow, right?
Absolutely.
It makes you, more proficient, and it makes you, more likely to have a quick and humane kill on the animal. So it's interesting.
Let me just a quick story on that, because I have some experience with that. I had never shot a crossbow till last year, and last spring I was involved in a hunting accident where I got shot during turkey season in my right side of my face, and it put my right eye out. Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, it happens. It's really unfortunate. But the point is, they were able to restore some vision in my right eye, but not to the point where I had any level of acuity, out of it. It's more like looking through a bottom of a Coke bottle. So I'm coming up to bow season, and I don't have the time to learn how to shoot left-handed, right? And I don't want to miss bow season. It's one of my greatest passions in life. And I'm really conflicted. I'm like, well, and we were going to Kansas. I'm like, am I just going to go to Kansas and hunt with my brother-in-law, just hang out with him? Or am I going to hunt? But I can't bow hunt. I can't shoot righty, but I can't learn left-handed and be accurate enough in the next 6 weeks. So I'm in that conundrum. How do I get accurate and make a good, humane, clean kill? And so I ended up borrowing a crossbow. Now, borrowing a weapon goes against my grain generally for hunting, right? Like you got to get a weapon, you got to get proficient at it. But I felt like if I could be proficient at it and limit my range, I could still enjoy enjoy my bow hunt, right? So went to Kansas, had a borrowed bow. I shot it a couple of days beforehand. And when I shot it righty, it was iffy because of my vision. So I had to shoot it lefty because my left eye is better. And I got to where I could just nail a target at 30 yards with a crossbow. Like I'm talking like this. In 2 days, I maybe shot 30 arrows, 30 bolts. And I am just absolutely knocking the center out of the target. So I'm like, I'm comfortable, and I shot it out to 50. I'm like, I'm comfortable out to 50, but I've never shot a deer with my bow in all the years over 25 yards.
Gee.
All the deer I shot, probably 45, 50 deer, never shot one over 25 yards because I like to get them in close. So the moral of the story is I go out hunting and we're 3 days into the hunt and I have an opportunity to shoot a really nice buck and I can't get him any closer than 50 yards. And he's out in the middle of a field and it's in the wide open and he's with a doe. He's distracted. It's the perfect situation. I can't get him any closer. I've tried. I've rattled. He's not getting any closer. He's going to move off. And I ranged him and he was 50. And I shot him left-handed, offhand, no rest, just shot left-handed, 50 yards, shot him right in the heart. He went 50 yards and died. And I was shocked. But I felt so confident making that shot because when I put that weapon on him, and it was a scoped crossbow, I think it was a 2-power scope maybe, I put it right on his breadbasket. I pulled the trigger. I just knew I was going to make a clean shot. So I didn't violate any of my, ethos, if you will, that way. But after that hunt, I was reflecting on the fact that how easy was that for me to have never shot a crossbow and then just picked it up a few days before. And I went out during bow season and I shot a deer that I would not have shot with my normal equipment. And I shot him at 50 yards. Yes, I made a good kill. But what it did was it actually emphasized the primary beef I have with allowing crossbows during bow season. And I did it. And I did it legally. And it enabled me to hunt. And because I had this disability, right? And I enjoyed it for all that it was. But it really highlights the advantage of a crossbow.
That's a great story, Jim. That's a great story. Congratulations on the buck.
Thank you. Yeah, it was interesting. I never in my life thought I'd shoot a deer with a crossbow ever.
Yeah.
And I did. And I took nothing away from the animal. I loved the experience. I enjoyed it, but it really gave me a lot to reflect on, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great story. And like sometimes things are happening in life that made you try things that you thought you will never try, and then you enjoy it, or at least have some thoughts about it, like you did. Jim, so I think it's a great moment now to kind of like a transition to another part of this conversation. You mentioned the word humane quite a few times.
Yes.
And obviously, obvious to me, maybe to other people as well, this is one of the biggest arguments of the opponents of bow hunting. And even on this podcast, I spoke with a few bow hunters, but I also spoke with veterinarians and even accomplished hunters, rifle hunters, who were expressing their, various level of disapproval for bow hunting based on the how humane the shot is. And it seems to me like the most common argument is that the arrow is lacking the concussive power, the concussive effect on the animal, where you have the effect where the water in it has a name that is eluding me right now, which has basically all the water in the body of the animal is disturbed and creates like a wave. It's called hydrophylactic shock or something like that.
Yep.
So it doesn't have a concussive power, therefore it is less humane. And I think, and that was also confirmed by many people who says like, well, why causing that concussion to the animal, how come you come to the conclusion that this is somehow more humane? If you can shoot an animal and we know those stories, you shoot an animal just look what happened and then comes back to grazing and then falls over, didn't even know what hit him. But then the argument is like, yeah, but how many shots like that really happens? It's one every now and then again, fundamentally, it's inhumane. So once again, I would ask you to once again on this podcast unpack this argument and how you feel about it. How does that sit in your opinion?
It's a great question. It has some complexities and nuance to it, but it's a great question. And so I'm no doctor or surgeon, right? But what I do know is that, having studied it, is that an arrow kills through hemorrhage, right? Like blood loss or lungs, blood loss, it just kills by hemorrhage. Whereas a bullet kills by shock, concussive power, and damage to the material, whatever it hits, right? And so I can only speak through, I'll only speak through experience here. And that is to say, I've shot, quite a few deer with my bow, and I've shot a fair number of deer with both a rifle and black powder and a shotgun slug. And I will say that during all the years of bow hunting, I may have lost 2 or 3 deer that I hit that I didn't recover in all the years of bow hunting, right? 35 years. And so, hey, wait a minute. That seems like, it is low. But it's because of the commitment to practice and be proficient and make sure the animal is close enough to make a clean shot and having the discipline to pass up anything that doesn't pass that litmus test of, I'm going to make a clean shot on this animal, right? So I've had to pass up some really nice animals at 35, 40 yards with my recurve. I'm just not going to shoot them, right? Because I thought I probably would have wounded them, and I probably would have at that distance with a recurve. So the animals that I've shot with my bow, I would say ballpark 80% of them, after I hit them, in some cases, they died within 100 yards. The arrow went through them all the way through them, and then they ran off, and I typically would see them fall or hear them fall within 100 yards, in some cases less. Because when you double lung an animal with a arrow and it goes all the way through them, like you said, they flinch, especially if you don't hit a rib. And I've had them go back to grazing and tip over in 8 seconds. If you hit a rib with your arrow and they feel that, they'll run for a while, but they'll often stop after 30 or 40 yards. And then that blood flow to their brain ceases because you've let the air out of their lungs, and they die in less than 10 seconds, like literally 7 or 8 seconds. And if you look at them on film, that's about how long it takes. With a rifle, unless you shoot them right in the head or in the, or in this, even in the spine, right? The animals I've shot with a rifle have, some of them have tipped over right where I shot them, but oftentimes you hit them and they run, even if they're hit well, because what kills them is that shock and ultimately that blood loss. But I would say that I don't have any personal evidence that would suggest that killing them with a rifle is more humane than taking an animal with a bow, because that just hasn't been my experience. And when an animal is shot with a bow, oftentimes it's not that concussive bang, that hits them and that bullet expands and explodes inside them. It just goes through. It feels like a, fly prick sometimes, right? Because they don't get spooked and all wild-eyed and run off. They'll run off 30, 40, 50 yards and stop and then fall over. So anyway, I know that it's a big topic out there, but in my experience, that just hasn't been the case if you apply the discipline to make a clean shot and don't take those marginal shots. And that's where the problem is. Guys pushing that envelope, and they wound a lot more deer, and that is a problem. I'm just calling that out.
Yeah, no, and you're right, because this is like the next argument that follows closely by, right? And just to finish off on the concussive power versus just sharp arrows cutting through the animal, I feel like if I were a deer and had to choose, I would always choose to be shot by the bow, by the arrow, because I don't see the argument of the concussive power making it more humane. If the time it takes is roughly the same, you're actually saving the animal this extra concussive power and the, sound of the gunshot and all these things. So that's just my comment on it. So let's talk about the difficulty, because like you said, this is another argument that comes next, that the guys are pushing the envelope, they're taking the shots that they have no business taking. My view on this is that, well, there are people who are taking shots with the rifle that they have no business taking.
Yes.
So that argument actually doesn't cut to me too much, but who am I? I live in a country that prohibits bow hunting. I never bow hunt, so that's why I have you on the podcast to talk about these things. But the argument then is that because of such a high degree of skill required, bow hunters are putting a lot of effort into training, into honing their skill, into shooting arrows. Then compared to the rifle hunters, who I know people who are just, they never on the range. They just shooting on the animals because it's so easy. You just putting in a crosshair and bang. And then when they miss, they go on the range to zero the scope because, I just missed the stag. And so then the level of training, so in my head is like, you are equally likely to take a shot that you shouldn't be taking if you're, this kind of person. But the bow hunter, by definition, at least should be way more skilled and trained because of the difficulty of it. Now, this is my, borrowed opinions and what I think. I want to hear your opinion. Is there any truth to that? Are there any caveats to that, what I said?
I think it's a fair observation from your perspective, in that knowing, over the years, hundreds of bow hunters and many, many gun hunters, most of the bow hunters I know, Tommy, are very committed to the sport, right? Because they enjoy archery, they shoot 3D shoots, that they around the area that they live in, the 3-dimensional targets where they're set up at different ranges to test their skill, estimate ranges and shoot and score. And they're out west where I live in Oregon now, they train physically, cardio, because there's big hills, right? Big mountains out here. And so they know they're going to have to be physically fit and to be able to execute a shot. So they're very committed to the sport. And therefore they really work on their proficiency with their weapon. I know many gun hunters that are also very committed to shooting accurately and go to the range and would never go hunting with a rifle without sighting in beforehand. But I know probably an equal or greater number that fall into the category you described, which is like, it's, you've been to the range this year. Oh no, my rifle was sighted in last year. I killed a nice buck with it. I'm good to go. Well, really? You know what I mean? Yeah, you've pointed that out. And so they go out and they miss. And I've had guys go to the range and it's, up a foot off and they miss, or worse, wound an animal because they didn't feel they needed to take the time because of the proficiency of a firearm. So I think what you characterized is reasonably true, but with any sport, especially blood sports that we're talking about here, just to be, candid, there are folks that endeavor to do it correctly and are really respectful about the animal and the sport and so on. And there are some smaller proportion that want to take the easy route, are willing to chance a long shot at an animal, even if they wound it, in the event that they might take it, doing things that they shouldn't do. And I think that exists in any sport. But when you're talking about shooting animals, I think it's really unfortunate that can be the case. And the easier you make it, in my opinion, the more it invites casual, less committed folks. And that gets right back to the conversation we had on crossbows, and anything that makes it easy invites more people not willing to necessarily put the time in to say, if it's that easy, I'll give it a try. And that to me is that rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah. They're more focused on the outcome rather than on the process.
Nailed it. You just nailed it. That's right.
What about the wounding rates? Wounding rates are higher with the bow. I think there's no questions about it. Or are they?
Well, it's all about shot placement, right? And so the opportunity to wound an animal with a bow is definitely there because of just the angle of the animal, right? Like if it's dead broadside and you shoot it right in the, right behind the front leg, you'll take out both lungs. But if that animal's quartering to you, even slightly, 15 degrees, same shot, you might hit one lung and miss the second lung, right? That animal, a one lung hit animal, can run hundreds of yards, right? And so you can wound them. But most are fatally wounded, right? Like most are fatally wounded. So that's where skills of tracking, understanding animal behavior, where they typically go, and their behavior after they're mortally wounded is really important. And, I take tremendous pride on my ability to track animals, and I don't give up. I've tracked them for days and hours on my hands and knees and have a very, very high recovery rate as a consequence. I don't give up if I don't see specks of blood. Like I'm following tracks, turned over leaves. I'm following directionally where I believe they're going to go. I understand my property. I know where they would likely to go. If they were one lunged and they were hit and they're going to go downhill, they're going to go toward water and they're going to go in thick cover. And I look there. So if you really work at it, you can recover a high percentage of any wounded animals. And when they're not fatally wounded with a bow, right? It's just like a clean slice. They often recover. Like they often do. I've killed I've killed a handful of deer that had a broadhead in their hip and they were fine, right? Or they had a scar, but they were fine. So there is an opportunity to wound an animal no matter the weapon you use. But as a bow hunter, I'm very committed to, because they die by hemorrhage, you follow blood, right? And you can recover most animals if they're fatally hit without doubt. So I'll just leave it there. That's one of the reasons we talked about advancements in technology earlier. Where do they make sense and where do they maybe go against the rules of fair chase? Lighted nocks, you know what that is? It's the lighted knock on the back of an arrow. It lights up when you shoot it.
Yeah, I know, but you can explain to the listeners.
Yeah, the knock is the end of the arrow that attaches to your string, and it's made out of plastic. And today they offer those that light up when you shoot them. They light up like with a little LED light, like light green or light pink. So when you release the arrow, you can see it fly and see it hit. And I believe that's a good advancement in technology, because the greater knowledge you have on where the arrow hit the animal, the better odds are you're going to recover it, because you're going to know where you hit. That's a good thing. When you have, for years shot broadheads that were traditional broadheads, like the old bear broadhead where you actually, it was like a razor, but you had to sharpen it yourself. So I'd sit there in front of the TV and sharpen it myself for hours till I could cut hair off. My whole arm would be bald because I'd use that as a test. My left arm would be just completely bald, get it going into bow season, because I was testing it, right? I'm like, yeah, if I can shave hair off my arm, it's good. It's right. But what I found is I tried one year the new mechanical broadheads, which fundamentally I was against, right? It's like, it's another technological gimmick, right? But I tried and tested the mechanical broadheads with a 1.5 inch cutting radius. And the very first deer I shot with one, I shot him, through both lungs, and the blood trail was amazing. I mean, because of the cutting radius. If you kill by hemorrhage, the more cutting, the better. So my point is, I believe mechanical broadheads are beneficial to the animal because of the larger cut radius, quicker kills, easier recovery, because the blood trail is much more substantial.
For people who are listening to this, like mechanical broadhead is a broadhead, like the blades of the broadhead opens on the contact with the animal.
Yes.
So that improves the flight of the arrow, I guess, because it doesn't have the broadhead with the blades on it.
Correct.
And it open, and then because of that, it can open to much, like you said, larger blades, basically, which makes a bigger cuts.
So exactly, you explained it perfectly. So the arrow is much more likely to hit where you're aiming it, meaning a good clean kill. And when it hits and those blades open up, it makes a very large cutting radius, which then leads to a very, very good blood trail. And that's what you want. You want to recover the animals you hit, right? That's the key. So those advancements in technology help recovery of animals, which I'm in favor of.
Absolutely.
Makes sense to me.
Makes sense. And look, we people who are more interested in the details of technical details of all the elements of the bow and arrow, we have an episode on the podcast. Also, it's called, I think, Sizzling Arrows, where we go into great depth on all the types of arrows and things like that. So I just don't want to go into technicals on it because we have way more interesting things here to cover. One other thing that you mentioned that I also heard earlier is that the wounded animals, the animals wounded with a as a result of a inaccurate bow shot, are more likely to recover, while the animals that are wounded by a gunshot, that's usually dead animal. Only it can take weeks or long time. So that's you kind of confirm that aspect of.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I just want to switch gears here a little bit and talking about how long, on average, how long it takes a person to practice with a bow before they get proficient in enough to be able to go and execute a shot at the animal. Having in mind that executing shot at the animal is quite a different deal than executing shot at the range because of the emotions and the buck fever and all those things. So I'm going with this thing here, like if anyone wants to try, and maybe even the question is like if people like myself or other who live in Ireland and the UK, they want to go hunting, they want to go bow hunting, and they can go to Spain or to France or to Hungary or whatever, the place in Europe, or maybe even fly to the US to do this, bow hunting experience. But they need to prepare. They cannot just, how long it takes to become proficient, and what would be your advice to person, like again, who lives in Europe and wants to prepare themselves for that sort of experience?
It starts with what equipment we're using. So I'm going to start with the most common, which is a compound bow. And when I say a compound bow, I'm going to assume that there's a set of sight pins on the bow sight and a release, because that's the most common setup you see today. Okay. So my son is a good example because he just took up archery this year. We got him a bow, set up the way I just described, and he became pretty proficient at the range in a matter of, let's say, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Now he's going 3-4 times a week. He goes to the range, he's shooting at 20 yards, then he's extending out to 30, but he's really I told him just focus on your form, meaning your release, nice and smooth, no jerky, just nice and smooth, focus on the fundamentals. And, in 4 to 6 weeks, when he came up here, he was shooting a very tight group at 30 yards. Meaning when I say a tight group, I'm talking about less than 3 inches. Okay, like that big. So that's good. That's pretty impressive. And now the question becomes, well, is he proficient enough to hunt at that point? No. And however, he's proficient enough to shoot accurately at a range. So let's call that 6 weeks. I think that's reasonable. A couple days a week, 3 days a week for 6 weeks, you can be pretty proficient with today's equipment.
It should be expressed with the hours on the range, right? Because like 6 weeks again, but 3 times a week for 6 weeks.
Yeah, literally, if you shoot 2 or 3 times a week, but you're shooting about, 75 arrows a time, right? And you do that over a period of 6 weeks, the equipment is so good these days, you can get proficient at the range. Okay. So in terms of elapsed time, I don't know how many hours that is, but it's not an inordinate amount of hours, right? It's reasonable. The next step before you would ever go hunting is you need to go out and shoot 3D targets at different angles at unknown distances. That's the next step. So, right? Because when I'm shooting 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards, even if you're shooting deer targets at an archery range, everything is controlled. Everything, the distance. The next step is to go shoot a 3D range where you're shooting at three-dimensional targets of deer or wild boar or elk or whatever they have as the targets. And you're shooting at different distances. So you might be shooting at 18 yards, 27 yards, 36 yards, whatever it is. And you have to determine, do you want to use a rangefinder or do you want to estimate sight without a rangefinder? For all my years of hunting, I was able to estimate yardages without that. But I would recommend having a rangefinder to know. Right? There's nothing wrong with that because, again, good, clean kill. So if you spend another, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks elapsed time or whatever time you can spend shooting three-dimensional targets, unknown ranges at more realistic angles like you would in the field, that's the next step. So let's call that another 4 weeks or so. Depends on how much time you can. Most of us work, so you can't do it every day. And then the last step would be to make sure that those last few practice sessions shooting three-dimensional targets, either in your yard or at a range, you're wearing the clothes you're going to hunt with. You're wearing gloves, everything, face mask, or whatever you're going to wear hunting, you're wearing on the range, and you're shooting your actual broadhead. And you do that for a couple weeks. Those are the phases. So if you think about that, you say, you know what, in 4 or 5 months over the period of a spring, summer, could you be starting from zero? Could you be prepared and equipped if you put that time in to go hunting confidently and make a humane kill on a big game animal with a bow? I would say that's reasonable.
Oh, I might say that was shorter period of time than I thought, but again, it's very compressed effort because it's like a constant going. But so in other words, like if someone would like to go for bow hunting experience trip next year, if they start today, then by that time next year they should be more than able to go and execute humane shot at the animal.
That's correct. And as a non-resident, I believe you can apply for deer permits in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. If you want, you can do it. It's just, I think, very unfortunate that we can't do it where we live. I came into hunt, and regular listeners of this podcast know this story. I said it many times that I came to hunting very late in my life. I was in the early 40s, late 30s for sure. Less than a decade, and I was an angler, and I wanted bow hunting. Obviously American shows and the TVs, like, I felt like I'm ready to graduate to hunting from fishing, and I want to go bow hunting because it was like so natural and like more like a fishing rod. You have like a bendy and the element, and then you have a line and all these things, and they're like, no, illegal. And I didn't even want to go into the whole effort of getting like a firearm permit and all those things. And it turns out like, no, I have no choice. I had to do this. But this bow hunting thing, other than, talking about it and educating people through the podcast, it is in the back of my head. I would definitely like to try it. To wrap this up, Jim, what would be like a foolproof advice for you, arguments for people who are looking favorably at bow hunting and they find themselves in the companion of other hunters, rifle hunters, who are, usually don't have any experience with bow hunting, and discussion starts about like, this is inhumane and should like, what would be your like a foolproof advice how to conduct that conversation and give the fair representation of bow hunting?
It's an interesting question. I've never been asked that question. And I would say that as a bow hunter, if I was in the company of a lot of gun hunters and they were challenging the humaneness of my sport, right? Is that what you're suggesting, right?
Yeah.
My response would be that no matter the weapon you choose to use, there are certain standards that you have to, and certain level of skills and commitment you have to put forth to ensure a humane kill. Whether it's a rifle or a bow or a crossbow or a muzzleloader, there is a certain level of commitment you have to make to become proficient, and discipline you have to apply on what shot you will and won't take. And what I can say for myself and other bow hunters that I know that are as committed as I am is that we make quick, humane kills at a high rate, 95+% of the time, right? And another stat I would say is I've only missed 2 or 3 deer in my entire life, missed it completely, because I just don't take long shots. I told you 25 yards. I'm not going to miss a deer at 25 yards. The ones that I did miss went down a hill and shot over their back. So I don't miss many. I know a lot of rifle hunters that have missed a lot of deer. Why? Because they're taking shots that they shouldn't take. Running animals, distances that they shouldn't. They're just taking a pot shot, right? So my sport is not any more or less humane than your method if we apply the same level of commitment to knowing our weapon and understanding its limits and being disciplined about what shot we take. So let's go grab a beer. That would be my response.
It's a great response. And, this is funny things that, for example, some hunters in Europe, like in Germany and France, they think bow hunting is inhumane, but then they shooting at running animals. It's how that is humane. If bow hunting is inhumane and you're just shooting a running deer and running, right? But that's a completely separate conversation. And I just want to end up with a story. This year in May, was it in April? I was on a symposium and a CIC event, and I was talking with the old hunter from Liechtenstein, and and there was also people from the US and the not a hunter but the guy who is really involved in conservation from the US was sitting at the table with us, and the topic got into the bow hunting. And, we started talking bow hunting, and I look at the guy from the Liechtenstein and I say, oh, there we go. Right. And then finally I goes so tell me what you think about bow hunting. You're against it. You don't like it. And this is a hardcore, old school European hunter. And he goes you know what? I was somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, and there was a bow hunter and he shot the deer. And I was in shock how quickly that animal went down. So I am not against bow hunting. I'm fine with bow hunting. And I was yes, it's probably the first time I hear a old school European rifle hunter who actually says it's great. The animal, because he thought that, animals hit by an arrow would be running, but whatever happens. And he was shocked. He couldn't believe how quickly that animal just expired, and that was it. So that's kind of a confirmation, and maybe that is that once you see something and once you try it, once you experience that firsthand, then you are in a much better position to offer opinions rather than just borrow an opinion and just repeat it without even experiencing anything yourself. Jim, it's been great pleasure talking with you. I'm just wondering, do you have any words of wisdom to all the hunters and otherwise who are listening to this podcast?
I do. As I was thinking about where you started and your listeners, most of them don't have an opportunity to bow hunt because of where they live and their restrictions. And I was thinking that what I wish and hope for all of your listeners who truly love the sport of hunting, I wish and hope that they all have an opportunity to bow hunt in their hunting lifetimes, and they make the commitment to do so, because the level of intimacy and adrenaline and the feeling that you get when you get that close to an animal and harvest it on its terms, and you had to fool it and make a good clean shot, is a level of adrenaline and intimacy that I've never gotten in all the years that I've gun hunted. And I've certainly I've certainly taken many animals with my rifle, which I enjoy as well. It's just a completely different feel. And I hope that you and your listeners who have the interest make that opportunity for themselves happen.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Jim.
Okay. My pleasure. Good talking to you.